You may be familiar with the idea that in most styles of writing, academic or otherwise, the primary unit of style would be the paragraph, right? Your basic building block of writing. Well, in journalism, your primary unit would actually be the fact. Journalism is, after all, a fact-driven practice, trying to convey the details of a situation with as much accuracy and credibility and objectivity as possible. And we'll see in future weeks how you can actually use the fact the same way that you use a paragraph to organize and structure your content. We'll come back to that later. For now, what we're interested in is, where do these facts come from and what do we do with them? As a journalist, the way we get facts is from sources. Now, sources are essentially anything that gives you information about a topic. Remember, you're not supposed to create the information out of the blue. You're not supposed to invent the details of a story as a good, responsible journalist. So all of the information you present needs to come through a source, be that a person or a text. Now, not all sources are created equally. Some are more valuable than others, and some are more credible than others. The first, most highly sought after, because it's the most useful type of source, would be the people most directly involved. These are your primary sources. Now, primary sources would be, for example, if you're investigating a forest fire, this would be the fire chief, the first responders. This would be the person who started the fire, if that's known. These are the people most directly involved with the core of your story. Now, if you can't get to primary sources, the next best thing would be what's called a secondary source. However, there are two different types of secondary source. There's the kind that is more useful, which are the ones that are willing to go on record. This is someone who has said, you can take it from me, I'm pretty sure Johnny set the fire, and I'm willing to go on record for that. I didn't see him do it, but he has a history of pyromania, and I think he's probably your guy. These are the people who are not necessarily directly involved, but the people who are adjacent to the story, the people who are maybe bystanders, someone who heard about it through hearsay, someone who witnessed something related to it, that sort of thing. Now, when you can't get a quotable source, the next best thing is, of course, an unquotable source. These are the people who are unwilling to go on record. You didn't hear it from me, but Johnny over there's got a lot of matches. When you work with a source, it's really important to note that legally you're not allowed to break confidentiality and share someone's identity if you told them you'd make them anonymous. You're not allowed to quote them if they didn't give you permission to quote them. So if someone says they don't want to be quoted, you're just kind of out of luck. You can, however, still use their information, but they're a little less verifiable to the reader because they don't know who the person is. So it's always best to back up an unquotable source with a quotable source. Have someone else corroborate the story. Of course, once you're starting to figure out what's going on with a story, you might need more information about the general topic at hand. And this is when you turn to background sources. Background sources could be texts about the history of the area, about the history of forest fires in that area. It might be a survey of firefighters in what the top causes of forest fires might be. It might be talking to all of the townspeople, trying to figure out who in the area might have had a history of walking through that forest. All of this stuff that sort of builds a general background knowledge about the subject matter. This can include web research, right? We're fortunate to live in this mixed up, mangled, convergent landscape where we have things like web scraping and Google searching, where we can crowdsource information. Social media throws an interesting cog into the works here. Social media is one of the most useful and simultaneously least reliable sources you can have, for obvious reasons. Social media, of course, does not tell you the truth. It tells you, however, what people think about what they perceive as the truth. So, if you're looking for what actually happened, social media is probably not the place to go digging. But if you're looking for what people think happened, social media can actually be an invaluable tool. It's a great way to talk directly to people, to gather a whole body of background information really quickly. You can conduct your own surveys. You can really put your finger on the pulse of what the public opinion is. Oftentimes, background information gives you a good starting point. And then you can climb up the ladder from background to maybe that leading you to someone who would be an unquotable secondary source. And they might give you then off the record kind of hint about Joe over there who keeps starting all these fires. And then you go find him and he becomes a primary source. So you can see how these sources sort of lead to one another, and you can build a robust body of information. And ultimately, you can put this together into the facts of your story. It's also useful to leverage these sources against each other. Maybe your quotable primary source here doesn't want to give you the information, but when you tell him that you already have the inside information from that unquotable secondary source, and he's willing to go and blow up his spot, that primary source will probably cave a little bit more easily. Now, that does not mean that when he caves, he's going to give you everything you want, because there are a lot of things to consider when working with sources. The first thing to consider is, where is the core of your story? Who are your core sources? Just because they're a primary source being directly involved doesn't mean that they're the right primary source. The police chief who arrived first on the scene would probably be a primary source, but he may not be intrinsic to the core of the story, because the police doesn't really deal with fires as much as a firefighter would. You also might actually be led down a red herring and think the core of your story is somewhere where it isn't. Oftentimes you might go and investigate this forest fire and find out that really what's at stake, what's at hand here, is that the fire department has been covering up a history of forest fires. And now the core of your story has shifted, and you might actually be dealing with a story about corruption in the local fire department. Don't be afraid to follow your rabbit holes and figure out where your core really actually is. The second thing to consider is, who are the stakeholders? Who has something on the line? Whose neck is out when you're talking to them? Does someone have money tied up in the outcome of your reporting? Does someone have something to gain or lose by how your story makes them look? They're often going to be more or less forthcoming with you if they have something to gain or lose. The thing to remember is that almost everyone has something to gain or lose. Even someone as benign as an innocent bystander may have some stake in the matter. For example, if they live in the town and a scandal could implicate their neighborhood and cause undue political unrest, they may not want to bring things to light that they might otherwise bring to light if they weren't living in that town. The next thing to consider is, of course, bias. Everyone has bias. You can't escape it. Some bias is more benign than others. If you live in a town, you're going to be biased either towards or against that town based on whether you enjoy living there or not. This could be political bias, or this could be simply favoring one firefighter over another because your daughter got to see the firefighter give a presentation at her school. Bias is really important to consider because, just like stakeholders, people will give you partial truths or slant their truth depending on what their implicit or explicit biases are, and they may not even know what those biases are. Whether they have an agenda or not, they still may not be giving you the clear and total untainted truth. Once you've picked your sources, even if they are as credible and unbiased and helpful as possible, it's worth considering the pathos that this is going to bring to the audience, the emotional effect and the emotional connection that the audience might have with this person. For instance, if someone tells you exactly what's happening and you get that information from an innocent bystander, a person in the street, how will the audience react to that? As opposed to if you get the exact same information from the governor. Most likely, people, even if the information has not changed, people will tend to be less trustful of a political figure because they think they've got something to gain or lose. They're trying to win you over, right? Everything is positioning for votes. So even though the information might be correct, who you choose to convey that information could have a major effect on whether the audience ends up sympathetic to your story or antagonistic against your story. The next thing to consider is simply facticity. How correct is the information being given? Now, oftentimes this isn't a matter of someone actually trying to deceive you, but studies have shown that our human imagination tends to get in the way and our memories are reliably unreliable, especially in times of trauma. Usually, when we experience something, our brain tries to make sense of it as it goes, and it often colors the way that we remember what we are experiencing. And so you might have two completely well-intentioned, totally forthcoming sources tell you two totally different stories about the same experience. And this does not mean that their testimony is invalid, but it does mean that you have not gotten to the truth of the matter yet. Often it's important to test sources against each other. Does one source corroborate the story of another, or does it seem to be an outlier? This can be a good way to start figuring out if what you're getting is correct. And another interesting phenomenon is that people would rather make up something that's totally wrong than say, I don't know. For example, in, I believe it was 2015, there was a study run that polled an audience on their opinion of the Affordable Care Act. And in this poll, 45% of the people polled said that they were in favor of the Affordable Care Act. They then asked the same people what their opinion of Obamacare was. 38% of them said they were in favor of Obamacare. And you can see the disconnect here because, as we know, the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare are the same thing. People apparently don't know that all the time. And so rather than ask the simple question of, what's the Affordable Care Act? Or what's the difference between the two? They will just make up, oh yeah, I'm in favor of that. Or, oh no, I don't approve of that. It has Obama's name on it. So we can often try as sources to give our honest opinions and give our honest account of things and fall drastically short. It's sad, but it kind of bears the question of what is a fact anyway? We are now in this era of post-truth and alternate facts. And so it becomes actually important to ask this question, what is a fact? Well, a fact is something that, as we've said, is verifiable by other sources, right? This is something that other people will tell you the same thing, and you will hear it over and over again. And similarly, that means that it will eventually accrue a consensus. Generally speaking, all people will agree on a fact, we hope. Another thing is that facts are indisputable. You can't rationally dispute a fact. If I tell you there's a chair in this room, unless you're a philosopher, it would get very difficult to dispute that there is a chair in this room. I would not be sitting here if there were not a chair in this room. A fact is something that is based on researched evidence. I can pick up that chair and hold it in my hand. I can sit in that chair. I can give it to someone else and they can also sit in this chair. All research seems to point to the fact that there is indeed a chair in this room, no matter how hard that philosopher tries to tell me otherwise. A fact refutes falsehoods. You can use a fact to disprove something that is false. For example, if someone comes into this room and says, there's nowhere to sit here, you can say, that's false. I can prove it. Here's a chair. There's a chair in this room. That is a fact. Therefore, the fact that you can not sit in this room is false. It refutes the falsehood. And finally, it welcomes scrutiny. You can investigate a fact. You can turn it over, turn it inside out, and try and figure out, poke holes in it, figure out if it is going to hold any water, and it welcomes that, and it cannot be broken by that. The book, Philak has an interesting quote. He quotes a source, if you will, who says, "If you and I had an argument and I produced facts from an authoritative source to back me up, you couldn't just blow that off. You might try to undermine my facts, you might counter with facts of your own, but you couldn't just pretend my facts had no weight or meaning." This is, after all, the basis of any good debate. And yet, here we are in this post-truth, alternative fact reality where we see this sort of thing happen all the time. Someone gives facts and someone else counters with other facts, other imagined things, other inventions, pretending that the facts have no weight or no meaning. This is a deep philosophical problem. It turns out that facts are very wiggly things because of our subjectivity. And so part of what your job as a journalist is to help figure out what the real facts are. You become a tour guide through the postmodern noise of this Wikipedia knowledge where anybody can post anything, opinion or otherwise, and pass it off as a credible fact. You have the task to either replicate the research that led to that fact to prove it or disprove it, or to rely on the trustworthiness of various sources that you know have been tried and true in order to validate the credibility of this source, of this fact. This brings us to the equally sticky territory of journalistic opinion and bias. Journalism needs to remain objective. You'll remember that we talked about the different types of articles you can write, and there's a special category for opinion articles. This is because we don't ever want to assume that anything a journalist writes is their own opinion unless they discreetly tell you that this is his opinion or her opinion. Opinions have to have their own category in the newspaper. They go in their own column because we want to make sure there is no discrepancy between fact and opinion. This means you have to untangle yourself from your own opinions and not confuse them for facts. This is why we work with sources. This is why you don't just tell things as you understand them. You have to tell things as other people understand them and aggregate a total of opinions or a total of experiences that amounts to some unified whole that we can call a fact. You have to ask yourself, how do I know this? When you write something, how do I know this? And if you can't answer that with pretty concrete explanation, then you shouldn't write it. Now, we also have to take into consideration the bias of our reporting, our own bias. It's a hard thing to do because whether you know it or not, you are biased in any story. If you've had any experience on this planet, then you are going to be biased towards or against anything that you come in contact with because you are a human and you have relationships to other things and other people. The goal here is to separate yourself from your bias and remain as objective as possible, or when you can't, to be as transparent about your bias as possible. This reminds me recently, in the throes of all of these sexual assault scandals and allegations that are coming out in the media, NPR was a heavy source of this reporting, right? They had been putting out a lot of the news about all of these scandals, trying to do justice to all of the different sides and different arguments. And in the midst of their reporting, it came out that their own staff was implicated into a sexual assault scandal. And they were forced with an option. It was clear now that in reporting, they could not approach this in an unbiased fashion because they were now implicated into it. So they could either stop reporting, or what they ended up doing was they reported on it even more heavily as if they weren't the organization implicated. They actually brought in their own bosses as sources to interview on the radio. And I watched these interviews, and it was astounding to me that they asked some of the most tough, hard-hitting questions of these bosses that I've heard anyone ask of any source. Things like, why didn't you tackle this when it first came out to light? Don't you care about me as your female employee? Or what are you going to do about this going forward to make sure that this does not continue in our media culture? They weren't letting their boss off the hook, even though they knew their job could technically be at stake, because this is the same person who could fire them if they make them look bad. Thankfully, NPR has a history of trying to be unbiased and objective. And so it's part of their values and it's part of their culture, and the bosses understand that. And so even the people in charge, even the people most directly implicated, on air applauded their own reporters for asking those tough questions and making them squirm, noting that they were doing everything in their power to try and correct and address the situations. Sometimes we just have to come clean. We just have to say, you know what? I'm biased, but here's my opinion, my biased opinion, and here's the best justice that I can do to these facts given my bias. Take it with a grain of salt. This is why it's so tricky. We all come at this from different perspectives, and no person's experience is invalid. No person's experience is false. However, they don't always amount to the whole picture. This is the difference between facts versus truth. If you want to get really philosophical about it, this is the difference between a relational model of the world where you actually see different truths all intersecting versus, say, a Platonic model of the world where you have one absolute truth that everybody somehow has access to in varying degrees. Truth is multifaceted. Truth is relative. Truth is relational. Truth is complicated. But if we triangulate it from enough perspectives, we may be able to actually get a holistic view of all of the different truths that make up the facts of a situation. One of the ways we do this is by trying to check for accuracy. We don't ever want to assume that anything is true. We don't want to take facts for granted. Double check, triple check names, dates, figures, statistics. An infamous example comes to mind. During the lead up to the presidential elections, Donald Trump got in a lot of hot water for retweeting this tweet, which seems to imply that black on black violence greatly outnumbers police and black violence. And it turned out that this was just completely false, fabricated, not even missourced or misquoted, not even interpreted differently, just completely fabricated. And we start to get to the question of who's responsible for facts, especially in the era of Twitter. Is a retweet an implicit endorsement? Trump tried to combat this and defend his position, saying, well, I didn't write it. I just shared it. You can take your own opinion on it. But in sharing it, are we endorsing it? Are we taking it on as our own voice? Especially if we're not contributing anything in terms of a perspective on what we're sharing. He's merely tagging these other people and sharing this falsified statistic. Anytime you're presented with something like this, you can't just take it for granted. This riled up a lot of people who assumed this to be true. You also don't want to extrapolate. Just because someone says something, you don't want to assume or extrapolate that that means they would also say X, Y, and Z. For instance, Gerald R. Ford was considering whether or not he was going to bail out a city. He ended up deciding not to bail out the city for a variety of complicated political reasons. This is what the press ran as their headline. Ford to city drop dead. Vows he'll veto any bailout. Now, while it may be true that that's how the city felt, It is not fair to extrapolate from his veto that he wants the city to drop dead. There's a friend of mine once told me we were talking about conflict resolution, and he gave me some of the most insightful advice that I've ever gotten when it comes to having meaningful conflict resolution. And he said, never assume you know what the other person feels. You can't assume the other person is mad. You have to ask them and see what they say. You can't assume they're mad for X, Y, and Z reason. You have to ask them and see. If you extrapolate from your perspective of the situation to what their perspective is, you'll often end up making a pretty big blunder and giving something that is less than true or less than a total view of the truth. Context can also count for a lot. If you don't give adequate context, it can totally skew the facts of a situation. One sort of roundabout nuanced occurrence of this was back in 2015, just after the Paris attacks in November of 2015. There was a rash of other posts on social media alerting people to other violence that has been going on. For example, Kenya attack, 147 dead in Garissa University assault, BBC News. There was public outcry because all of this other violence was going on, and people were posting things like this response: first Paris and now Kenya, I beg, please let it stop. People started giving money to Kenya to try and help in this relief effort. The problem was BBC, for all they do right, in this case, did not give adequate context. What they didn't say was that the Kenya attack actually took place months prior over the summer, not a few days after the Paris attack. And so, though it had not been reported, this was not actually new news. This was not a new occurrence. What ended up happening was that people ended up pulling their money from supporting the freshly broken Paris attacks and reallocating them elsewhere to Kenya and other places, places that did need the help, but were in less of a dire situation than Paris at the time. And that put Paris in hot water because they were now not receiving the aid that they needed because focus was shifted elsewhere. It's important to get the subtleties and the technicalities correct. The devil is in the details, as they say, and it is important to know that if you're talking to someone who really knows what you're talking about, they will call you out on when you get something almost right. You can't be almost right most of the time if you work in a media organization, Philek says. You have to be entirely right all the time. He gives these examples. By defeating the Soviet Union in the Miracle on Ice game, the 1980 United States Olympic hockey team won the gold medal. Almost. It turns out that if you actually look into the technicalities of it, the Miracle on Ice game was not what won them the gold medal. It was what put them into the finals to win the gold medal. Sounds correct, gets the general gist of it across. Yes, they did go on to receive the gold medal, but not technically correct. Or Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world. Well, it turns out it's not. It is the highest mountain in the world. Any good mountain climber or any good geologist would tell you that tallness measures from the base of a mountain to its peak. Highness measures from sea level to its peak. Mount Everest is actually the highest mountain from sea level to its peak. However, Mauna Kea is actually taller if you count all of the mountain that goes underwater. Almost correct, but not quite. Or, Dr. Jonas Salk, born of Russian Jewish immigrant parents, invented polio in the 1950s. Should be pretty clear at first glance, he did not invent polio in the 1950s. He invented the vaccine for polio in the 1950s. This seems silly, but we do this sort of thing all the time without thinking. For instance, help me raise money for cancer. well, you don't actually want to raise money for cancer. You want to raise money to fight cancer, to cure cancer. We're raising money to help homelessness. Technically, you don't want to help homelessness. We don't need more homelessness. We want to help alleviate homelessness. We want to help homeless people. These subtleties and technicalities can often cause situations to run away from us. So it's important to get these things correct. We've covered a lot of ground today. We started off trying to figure out our audience. We took our 5 W's and 1 H and foci, and we pointed them at our audience in order to get to know them a little better so that we could divide them up into useful chunks called segments. And these segments, we learned, could be geographic, demographic, or psychographic. Geographic being segmented according to where they are. Demographic according to similar traits or characteristics, age, race, gender, etc. And psychographic, the similar values, commonly held beliefs, the intangible things. That allowed us to then try and identify what sort of content might connect with our audience and develop a beat that we could follow. These beats could be thematic, based on industry, geographic, based on location, or conceptual, based on intangible ideas. And so that allowed us to then fill these beats with actual content, articles, which we are discovering can be of any number of 5 choices: hard news, features, op-eds, reviews, and sports. Now, our next task was to take our 5 W's and 1 H and our foci and point them back towards their original purpose to investigate the subject matter in our articles themselves, these building blocks called facts. In order to get these facts, we had to work with some sources. And we learned that these sources come with a lot of baggage, but they can be primary, quotable secondary, unquotable secondary, or background sources. We have to remember to consider who our core sources are, who are the stakeholders, who has something at stake here, and as a result, what their bias might be, what pathological effect they might have on the audience, and how correct are they? How accurate is the information they give us? Never one to take anything for granted. We have to dig into these facts. Don't assume that anything we're given is true. Fact check, double check, triple check, recreate experiments to recreate those facts. Don't extrapolate. Give adequate context and make sure the subtleties and technicalities are also correct. Once you've done all this, you are then poised to become this tour guide through the Wikipedia nonsense of this post-truth society. That is where we are now, trying to figure out how to do our job as content creators to build a sense of coherency and truth and cohesion to the world around us. So, you've gotten acquainted with convergence culture. You've started to figure out your place in this convergence culture as a brand, gotten to know thyself, as it were, and you've gotten to know thy audience and how to connect with them. So next week, we'll be starting to investigate just how to go about putting pen to paper and put all of the nuts and bolts into place. Until then, in our discussion forums this week, we're going to be digging a little bit more into this idea of post-truth, fake news, alternate facts, bias, how we have dealt with it, and what we are to do with it as we go forward. So I look forward to that conversation. Otherwise, I will see you next week.